All right, well, hello everybody, and welcome to our webinar on some real-world examples and conversation on oncology studies, which we all know are quite a challenge. My name is Karen Wills. I'm the head of marketing here at Strategicon Pharma, and I'd like to just welcome you all to our webinar. Some very, very brief housekeeping here is if you have any questions that you have for any of the panelists, there is a question panel on your control panel, and if you just enter it into there, we will be tracking that, and hopefully we'll get all of your questions answered. And if not, we'll be happy to take them offline if we start going way too long. So with that, I'm pleased to introduce our esteemed panel of experts that we have here, and hopefully you'll enjoy listening to all of them. So I'm going to let them go through and do their own introduction briefly, and then we'll launch right into the questions. So Bill, would you like to introduce yourself to the audience, please?
Certainly. So my name is Bill Karich. I am the Associate Director for Business Operations within our Clinical Research Development Department at CSL Behring. Our primary focus is on rare disease. The rare disease space, we have some oncology space as well that we have been focusing on for as long as I've been at the company, for about 6.5 years, and our pipeline suggests that we'll continue on those paths. So yeah, that's me in a nutshell.
All right, thank you. Radhika?
Yeah, hi there everyone. My name is Radhika Sivaramakrishna, and I'm Head of Project Delivery at Strategicon. And I have about 25 years of experience in the field. Like to think of it as all 4 sides of the business. So I've been in on the sponsor side in multiple different roles as head of project management, clinical operations, process excellence, outsourcing, etc. I also have been on the CRO side, leading multiple portfolios of different clients. I've also been on the site side at 2 different premier institutions, and I've also been on the vendor side, and I'm now again on the vendor side, in terms of providing services to CROs and sponsors. Very excited to be part of this panel.
Thank you. Well, it sounds like you have a great, well-rounded background and should add a lot to our panel. Thank you, Radhika. And Brad, how about you?
Yep. Karen, thanks for inviting me to the panel. My name's Brad Miller. I'm dialing in from a nice sunny Sydney morning here in Australia. My title.
That out, didn't you?
I did. My title is the Clinical Operations Director here at Bioceptor, and we're currently focusing on our antibody therapeutic and our CAR T therapeutic programs.
Excellent. Well, thank you, and thank you for joining us from the sunny down under. It's getting colder here in the Northeast, but I'm telling you, we got to get down there sometime and visit you. So yeah, but Bill, we're thinking of a road trip, Radhika, me, and you, and we'll go visit Brad. What do you say?
By all means, come on out. So.
All right. Okay. Well, so we have a few questions here that I'll kind of read a little bit of an intro, and then I'll direct the question to one of you guys, and the other 2 will have a chance to jump in on their responses and add things in. So that'll be kind of the format here. So we'll start like kind of the beginning of an oncology study, which they have a unique structure in that they generally include escalating or expanding cohorts, starting with 3 or 4 patients to determine efficacy and safety. And this process could go through 3 or 4 steps to get to a maximum tolerated dose. Once that is determined, you can then expand to a larger group of patients and move into further phases. However, modeling these patient groups and the timing clearly complicates enrollment and the cost of the study. So when setting up an oncology study, how do you budget for this complication? And then what are some of the pitfalls that you may have fallen into? So Brad, I'm going to throw that question to you first.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. I think one of the key parts of addressing this question is to make sure you undertake some what-if analysis. So let's go through a couple of different scenarios. Let's say the first scenario is our best case. Let's assume there is no DLTs, recruitment is relatively quick, there's no slowdown with site activation, there's no screen failures, and let's look at the timeline associated with that. Then let's move on and go to a worst case scenario. So let's assume there's DLTs at every dose level, there is slower recruitment, there is screen failures, and understand those two different timelines. I was looking at budgeting a standard 3+3 traditional design for an oncology study. And just by adding one DLT to each of those different dose levels, we increase the study length by approximately 45 weeks, so 10 months. So once you understand that best case and that worst case scenario, and you understand the timeline implications of both of those, then you can come back and say, okay, well, what's that going to do to our costing? One of the other big key elements of an early stage clinical design, especially for a traditional 3+3, is to look at the additional number of patients that you'll need if you hit those DLT dose levels. So in my design that I was working on, we went from 18 patients if we had no DLTs, up to 36 patients if we did. So not only was there that massive increase in timeline, but there was also a massive increase in patients. So I think my advice can be summarized into really one key step is to do the what if analysis, look at multiple scenarios, understand the timeline implications, the subject number implications, and then you can go back and say, okay, well, what are the implications from our CRO budget as well as our, different vendors, central labs, imaging, etc.
Okay. Bill, do you want things to add to that?
Yeah, so similar to what Brad had mentioned there, it's really about your planning as you're thinking through, at least from our perspective, what we've seen is it comes up with the planning at the beginning and do plan every different scenario, every thought process, every nuance, and then throw something like COVID on top of it just for fun to figure out what countries are going to stay open, which ones are not going to stay open, how does that affect your enrollment. It's similar to most of oncology trials as well as a rare disease. There are things you can control and plan for, and there are things you can't. And a lot of those are discovered along the way, similar to amendments that are known and not known. So when you are modeling, one of these studies, it's important that you do understand, and as Brad had mentioned, the intricacies of each cohort, or how many different cohort escalations are you going to have? Is it sequential? Is it in parallel? And you really have to think through how one directly affects the other. Some may not. What I've found that when we are planning these kind of studies is that we really do it in a visual perspective. So we plan our patient groups and we understand how that progresses through the journey of a study. But it does come back to just, I think for an oncology study that we had just built, or I think we built 25 different scenarios at the beginning, and they're coming back to do more changes, which is good because we can always reflect back on all of our historical scenarios to figure out what, even if there was a small adjustment in this one scenario, how it directly impacted all the downstream effects. So it's just having those difficult conversations, not planning best case scenario only, and thinking through all options. So.
Okay, Radhika?
Yeah, I think Brad and Bill pretty much summarized this very well. So I think the planning upfront is super important because I've been in multiple situations where, of course, senior management wants everything done in 6 months, right? But you have all these different cohorts. And if you don't really think through the details of all of them, how much time has to be where you have to wait for perhaps the DMC to look at your data and then agree to, be able to go the no-go to the next cohort, all of those gaps, planning the best and the worst case, you might fall into a situation where you've really underestimated both the number of patients, the budget, the timeline, and all of that. So I think for me, the upfront planning is really important. And of course, if you had a tool to do that where you can just lay this all out would be the best. Oftentimes we do this on, many sponsors may just send this out to the CRO to kind of get an estimate, and they may not have looked at all the different scenarios, and you may just get the best case, and then you present that to management, and then later on you find that actually it takes several months longer than what you had planned. So I think it's really important, as both Brad and Bill said, to do that planning, to really work this out. Sometimes the bottom-up approach of really putting, pen to paper or in a system, really fleshing that out, being able to model all those different scenarios and then present that and then figure out, of course, the answer may be somewhere in the middle, but unless you know the boundary of what you're looking at, you may fall into the error of underestimating things, which might later on you'll pay the price of having to do an amendment or having to update your budget. None of that is very pleasant to do later. Yeah.
Yes, I'm sure it's with many things. The longer you leave it, the the worse it gets. So
Yes. Yes.
So we do. So actually, what I'm going to do now actually is we're going to launch our first poll. We actually have a poll to it'll help our panelists here to get an idea of what the audience thinks are their biggest challenges. So let's see if we can have let me launch the poll here. Poll must be closed to enable screen sharing. So, all right. So I guess it's distributing the poll to you guys. Hopefully people can see the poll. Feel free. We'll give you a couple of minutes to add it, and then we'll go ahead and show what the results are. So for our panelists, the question is, what are the most significant challenges that you see in oncology studies? And their options are, too many or unclear assumptions, need to depend too heavily on CROs, labor intensive old technologies and systems, complexity, difficult to rebudget and create scenarios, and then lack of historical database. So looks like it's pretty stable right now. Let me close the poll, and I'll share it for you guys. Can you see the poll results?
I see 3 different colors. So how do we interpret that?
So yeah, so it's the it's a little odd. So right now the red is we have about 25% of the attendees say there's too many or unclear assumptions. 33% say that they need to depend too heavily on CROs. 25% say labor intensive, old technology and systems, and 17% say it's very complex and difficult to rebudget and create scenarios. And nobody has an issue with a lack of historical bid database.
Yeah.
So that was
yeah.
So that was interesting. So we might end up coming back to that as another question for you guys. Okay, so let's. All right, here's a question from the audience. Do you guys want to take questions in line, or the question comes? Yeah, okay, so the question is, how much time on average does it take from final enrollment model to improved budget, ballpark range? So once you get your final model. So Bill, do you have any sort of approximation on that?
Yeah, so from your final enrollment model, which is a component of when we're doing the forecast, is to actually build the model within the tool. It doesn't take long at all. It's really evaluating all the intricacies. So if we have an enrollment and you have to stop for the next cohort, and you plug that in as different patient groups.
Yeah.
The system works like most other systems. It's garbage in, garbage out. If you put minimal things in there, you're going to get something out there that you can't really stand on. So the more intricate details you have and look at help. But the value that I find with the tool is locking the assumptions or inputting the assumptions and then continuously going back and editing them and tweaking them to see the progression of what you're adding. And you can put notes in there. There's so much flexibility within the system that we use that I mean, if I have all of the input I need to build a budget, I could build it in 10 minutes. I mean,
how long would it have taken you before you had the tool?
Oh God.
Come on, I had to ask the question. It was either me or Radhika.
Yeah.
Well, the accuracy is the component,
okay,
right?
Fair enough.
So you can't really go back and dig and I'm not surprised that poll had nothing about, nobody found it was difficult to go find historical bids and information, because this is all research. It's all different. It's sometimes what you went out with before is garbage. So why do you go back and look at it?
Fair enough. Fair enough.
But yeah, it would take forever, honestly.
Yeah. Brad, how about you? How was your experience?
Yeah, I think that's just really going to add to what Bill was saying. It's like when you used to develop a budget in Excel and you'd have budget final version 9. And I think that, to go back and say that you've ever really finished, I think that's a bit of a misnomer. I think, yes, you've finished. Yes, that's the one you've presented. But once you start to get your actual data, you start to know your recruitment rate, you start to know your site activation rate, then you go back and you revisit it and you provide an update based on the data that you've got in. And so I don't think that we've ever really finalized. And, we go back and we present to our board and say, okay, well, this is where we thought we were going to be 3 months into our study. This is where we are. And this is what we think might end up happening to the course of the study as we move forward. So I don't think it's ever really a finished final version.
Okay. Radhika, anything to add?
No, I think they pretty much said it all. I would say I've done this several times in the manual way, and it takes a very long time. And this is where I think, to Brad's point, this is like progressive refinement, right? As you get more information, which is why doing it in a system always makes sense, because if you have to do it in multiple Excel sheets and keep progressing that, it's much more complicated. It does take time to recalculate everything, that's why I think it's helpful if you were just able to plug it in. And also the plugging in helps to make sure that you haven't missed anything, because I find frequently people forget to budget the time that a DMC, for example, might need to look at the data before you can proceed to the next cohort. And so those 3 weeks or 2 weeks, whatever you budget for them to look at things, keeps getting missed. And so you've lost, you've underestimated the timeline by several weeks, so these so I think having something which can get you those things much quicker will definitely help.
Yeah, excellent. And it does have an audit trail as well for what you've done, correct?
That's
excellent.
Right.
Yeah. So, all right. So let's look at we were just looking at the start of the trial. Let's look at the tail end. And we know that oncology studies typically follow patients for survival, either as a primary or secondary endpoints. And even though most of the patients may have finished, you may have 2 or 3 patients or 4 or 5 or whatever that continue, which requires you to keep the study open for who knows how long, an indefinite period. So Bill, I'm going to throw this first one to you. So what are the challenges you've encountered in budgeting for this undefined period, and what advice do you have for our listeners?
So I think this is where it kind of becomes more of an art form versus a straight science in terms of how we build these budgets, and we look at the ongoing follow-up. I think you have to kind of treat them as almost either separate cohorts or just a separate group of patients, because they are going to extend. Some are going to extend for much longer than others based on when they entered the trial versus when they exited the trial. So you kind of have to be creative and lock that scenario in place so that you can adjust your expectations, whether it's 3 patients, 4 patients, 10 patients. It all comes down to the planning at the beginning, and then really when you're at the end, what could happen, and kind of assessing that as you go. There is a cost implication that's associated with it, but understanding, when you're following up with these patients, or what does that look like? What does that tail end of the study look like for the patient? And then how many is it going to be? What's the actual lift required for internal resources, external resources, as well as the patient? So you kind of have to think of a couple different options and figure out how to build it in a way that is scalable.
Radhika?
Yeah, I would.
What Bill's saying, so I'll let you go next.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Yeah. So no, I do agree with what Bill has said. That is, I think it's really, there are many things to look at, right? Because if you're looking at survival, for example, time to certain events like survival or, death or things like that, then certainly, you need to have some, it depends, of course, on the particular subspecialty of oncology, based on the particular cancer, what you might expect, what that tail looks like. And then, of course, if you are able to model that and make sure that, it's realistic, because I think this is where sometimes there's a tendency maybe by the CROs to overestimate the budget, where they might apply the flat rate just because, you've got this long tail where you may have to keep the study open for several months longer just to follow those 2 or 3 patients, which are really like gold. I mean, it's great for the treatment if there are 2 or 3 patients who are there that long, right, on the study. It's a great thing for the study itself. But there is a tendency to overestimate the budget, which is why I think you need to really assess carefully what that extra work is, because it's probably only a couple of sites that need to be left open, things like that. So you've got to look at the budgetary and operational considerations when you're thinking about that phase of the study.
Okay. Excellent. Brad, anything to add to that? What do you do at the tail of the studies?
Yeah, so I think it really depends on the phase of the study as well as the clinical and commercial goals. So a lot of my experience has been in the earlier phase clinical trials, phase 1, first in human type studies. So overall survival in that instance isn't as important as what it would be in a phase 3 pivotal registrational study. So what we've often done is to say, we don't want to have a site that's open with a single patient left looking at overall survival. So what we might do is say, okay, we want to look at median overall survival, or we want to look at survival at 6 months or 12 months, or we'll say we'll continue survival until we have 90% of patients off the study. So we can come up with some ways to say we don't want to be controlled by those last couple of patients that remain on the study. But again, I think it's really important to say what are our clinical and commercial goals when making that decision. And I think it's a much easier decision in an earlier phase 1 study than what it is in later phase studies.
Excellent. So Brad, I'm going to keep you on the hot seat for the moment. And in oncology studies, and I know you and I have discussed this previously as well, data collection requirements can be very complicated because you will take data cuts at probably more frequent intervals trying to figure out what's going on. So what are the budget considerations that you integrate into your planning in terms of the frequent data cuts to your plan, and how do you do that?
I think that this is a massive, massive question that has more than just budgetary implications. So first of all, I think we need to start with the why. What's the purpose of doing the data cut? What interim results do you want, and what are you going to use them for? So I think if you're going to use them for a dose escalation decision at a safety review committee meeting, you're going to be focusing on one set of data. If it's to go and do a further regulatory submission, perhaps in a different jurisdiction, perhaps for a different indication, that's going to be a different set of data that you're going to need. So once you understand that why, then you can look at what data do we need. So again, going back to the example of the dose escalation decision, that's primarily going to be focused on DLTs, on adverse events, all things related to safety. If it's going to be a regulatory submission, then it might be your entire database that you need. If it's for internal reporting purposes, it might be around PK/PD data. If it's to the board, it might be to preliminary efficacy. So once you understand what data it is that you need to focus on, then I think you can look at what quality of data that you need. So do you need clean data? Does it need to have gone through a source data verification process? Will dirty data do? So again, if we look at a dose escalation decision with a safety review committee, if those investigators form part of that committee to do that dose escalation, then dirty data might be appropriate because they can talk to their experiences that they've seen with the patients. If it's a regulatory submission, then it's going to need to be clean data. So I think, again, once you understand that data quality, you can start to build that into your budget. And then I think the last one that you need to consider is the how. So again, is it just going to be a PDF printout from your ECRF, in which case you can do that yourself. It's not going to be an additional cost from your CRO partner, and it's going to be relatively easy. I think probably the other end of the spectrum is if it needs some high-level detailed analysis to be conducted on that data, in which case you're going to have to involve biostats as well, and that's going to have some pretty big budgetary implications? Or can it just be a data export into Excel, you do some crude preliminary analysis yourself, and that's going to be sufficient? So I think, again, it depends on what your aim is, what data you need, who your audience is. Only once you understand that can you then go back and say, let's determine what the budgetary implications are.
Okay. Bill, what do you think? You're on mute, Bill.
Sorry, my bad. I was going to say I couldn't agree more with Brad. I think, I think everything he laid out with the why, what, how, these are all critical elements when we're planning a study. And I think that often at times at the beginning of a study, they're thrown out. They're like, oh, we'll probably have a data cut. And the key point, or, and maybe at that time, the person who's saying, oh, we'll probably have a database, interim data cut, and they don't really understand all the implications downstream, or when we're building a CRF booklet, that all the source datification that has to be verified in a data cut, for whether it's a submission for clean data, dirty data, it's these are things that don't seem like they would have huge implications, but they do significantly downstream. So the better we can articulate that in the beginning is always the best in my opinion. But this is research, so things do change, and that's kind of the beauty of scenario planning, is you can plan all these different scenarios. You can do it on enrollment, you can do it on timing. We have some trials where we're doing a cut after people have received a couple of weeks of dosing, or after a certain number of patients have completed a trial. I'm trying to be careful with what I say. A certain number of patients completed trials. So each of them have different endpoints and different outcomes and different purposes. So I think, exactly what Brad said, understanding what we're going after, what's the target, is incredibly important before we determine if we're going to bring in stats, data management. Is there programming because it's different systems? There's all these downstream effects that you could easily turn a data cut from a simple, a couple $100,000 to, a couple $1 million, depending on the size of the study and data. So it does require additional thoughts is what we're going after in those data collection.
Okay. Radhika, anything to add?
Yeah, just to read, I think both of them have again covered that. I think the main thing is the planning, right, upfront, because oftentimes I've been in situations where we are rushing to get all this done, and then of course, it hasn't been budgeted for, so there's always a change order with the CRO because you haven't actually thought through what are the data cuts. So I think knowing this in advance, and to Brad's point, really figuring out why you need the data, because some of them, you can live with the dirty data. You may not need additional monitoring visits to kind of clean the data, whereas for others, you may need to do it. And, if you know that you already need all these different data cuts, then you have to keep the data clean all the time, ongoing, rather than having to do a big bolus cleaning just before the data cut, which is very, very stressful for everyone. So I think I would just stress that I think, before we talk about the budget, I think the planning of what all you need, what the purpose is, and when it might come. And then, of course, if you're able to model that in your budget planning, so that you make sure that you have budget allocated for that, and that you haven't underestimated the number of cuts you might need. Because again, to Brad's point, it may be for different purposes, right? It may be for a DMC committee, it could be for a conference, you want to present some early results or something like that. Each of these has a different purpose. They may have different timings, but if you can, as much of planning that you can do would help you. And that would also not be a sticker shock if supposing you've already budgeted for it, so that senior management suddenly doesn't realize, doesn't think that, oh, you've got another $2 million that you're asking for, which hadn't been put in the budget earlier.
All right, thank you. We're gonna go to a couple of questions from the audience now. So I'll shoot these to one or the other of you. I guess Bill, I'm gonna shoot the first one to you, and I'm not sure you can actually answer this without a little more thought, but we'll give it a shot. So here you go. You ready? What are the absolute minimum assumptions you need to get a very high level ballpark?
Oh, that's an easy one.
There you go. Sure.
I've gotten as much as one sentence before to build a ballpark. I mean,
Is that where the dartboard comes in?
yeah. I mean, honestly, it depends. It depends on how you kind of have to understand what are they going after. Is it just to confirm their back of an envelope guess? Is it, you know, and this one sentence submission I got was so targeted towards a certain disease state and a certain indication, and it was like I just kind of said I can't do anything with that. When you're in the system, there's probably about 10 critical data points that are easy to find, or at least kind of guess through conversation that you can identify pretty quickly with the stakeholder who's asking. And it's usually, how many visits do you think it's going to be? What level of complexity is it? Or, you know, is it going to be a ton of samples? Is it going to be a lot of lab work? You know, so you can kind of determine your CRF pages. A lot of it does rely on historical information, but really just understanding what is the design of the study and how is that going to look? If it's 5 visits and they're within 4 weeks, your CRF book's probably going to be pretty light, which then means your source data verification is going to be light. There's all these other downstream effects that are going to be impacted by just a smaller CRF book, your data points. So I mean, it could honestly be, I have a template that I use to send out to my stakeholders to say if they want something built, here's all the fields that would be great if they could provide it, and then here's some highlighted ones that I can't build it without, and it's probably 10. So.
Okay. Okay, Brad, how about you? What do you think are the minimal assumptions that you need to get a high level budget?
I think like Bill, it's very much how long's a piece of string. I think patient numbers, phase of study are probably 2 of the big key things. Once you sort of have that broad understanding, you can make some guesses on some of the other things. To Bill's comment, you know, like it's going to be a ballpark. It's going to be between X and Y, and X and Y are probably going to be 50% below where you think and 50% above where you think. I think one of the big key things is also the timeline. So, you know, like, are we intending on doing this? You know, is this a 6-month study or is this a 3-year study? Because I think that's probably going to be your biggest driver of cost when you know very little else about your study.
Okay, Veronica, anything to add, or I can throw you another question?
Oh gosh.
All right. No,
I
we'll
think
give everybody a shot at this. So the next one is it says, how is risk incorporated in a budget, and what % of the budget is contingency? Do you have just a point blank contingency number in there?
Is that question to me or?
Yeah, go for it. You can go for it, and then I'll let the guys take a shot.
Sure, yeah. So I think I would say, yes, it's always good. You know, coming from a project management background, I would say that risk, you know, planning is very important. So you should have probably about, I would say, ballpark about 10% contingency. I would like to see what the others say too. But then again, you know, you've got to, I would say that when you're doing this initial stage for planning, it's good to model the worst case and the best case, so that you know that it's somewhere in the middle. So you at least know the bracket, the book ends of what it might be. And then where you have, I mean, this is where, you know, with the scenario planning, you might try put in different options. You know, for example, there might be some things which are fixed, like, for example, your treatment period. Again, you know, as we said, for something like where there are multiple DLT breaks in between, you might have an extended period. So you can kind of model those bookends. And I would say plan for about a 10% variance within that to embed as for contingency, you know, but then you'd still have those bookends to kind of have a guesstimate of what the budget might be.
Okay, Bill, do you 10% more or less?
So I would preface it with it depends, right?
Sure.
The end all be all answer. It depends when it comes to forecasting. You know, I think as we do the first layer of ballpark estimates, I've compared it to some of our outsourced CRO bids, and we do it so early on. It usually was like it was 20%, but historically, and this probably isn't great for CSL, so I hope nobody's on the call. It's like you have to reflect back and say, these are the vendors that we've used historically. Did we buy well? Was that a good contract resource? And so you kind of have to reflect on that as well. And that was where we got the 20%. But then you start taking a closer look at the assumptions that kind of roll out of this ballpark, and you have to really assess, what is your monitoring strategy? What does your enrollment curve look like? Is it one patient per site per month? Is it one patient every 6 months per site per year? I don't know how that would work out, but you kind of have to start thinking a little bit more granular, because that all has significant impact. If your monitoring strategy is to do 100% SDV, you're going to have a lot more time on site.
Right.
If you're going for 40%, which then reduces your IMVs, the frequency of visits. If your enrollment is very light, do you need medical monitors calling the site for 4 hours a week? All these things translate into cost, and it's driven by hours. So the first layer is the ballpark. The contingency can go both ways. It can screw you. It can be helpful. If you have specialty labs, obviously, those are going to be very specific to a study. So you kind of have to assess those on an ad hoc basis. But for your core level assumptions, your core level services, I mean, I could say 10% is a comfortable number, but it really depends on how granular you want to get to refine and adjust.
Okay. Brad, how about you?
Yeah, so the thing that I always start off when I start talking about budgets is I make sure that whoever my audience is, they're aware that my budget is guaranteed to be wrong. The most important thing is, how wrong is my budget? So when we're at the very early stages of doing our budgeting and our forecasting, we generally include a 25% contingency cost. As we progress through the stages, as we start to say we've identified the sites, we've identified the investigators, we've actually got some firm costings from all of those parties, then we start to reduce that contingency down as we firm up our numbers. And how much we end up with at the end of the study, I think to Bill's point, that's variable, that's going to depend. I think, a 10 to 15% for our final budget is normally where we're at, but we're normally starting with a lot bigger until we can refine that down a lot more.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. Sorry, I totally agree with that. When I said the 10%, it was more after you've done all the detailed modeling, because you would start with a much higher level budget and keep coming down, and the variance is always higher when it's more approximate, right? And we are doing at a high level. That's why it's nice if you had a system which allows you to do it at different levels, a high level in the beginning when you have very few details for the study, then it kind of is progressive refinement as you get further. And then the amount of risk variance that you can build in is correspondingly lower, because you're getting closer and closer to a more accurate budget. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think to kind of add on to that, as I'm sure everybody else here, when someone needs a budget forecasted or built for them, they want it done in 3 hours, and they don't have the assumptions, and they struggle with the idea that we don't have it all right at our fingertips, and we do need some extra stuff, so we can give them a number, but as Brad, you said, it's going to be wrong.
Yeah.
How much detail will help me figure out how wrong it's going to be? So.
Yep.
Okay. Well, like Bill said, that it depends. So, all right. So on to our next question here. So now that you have all this information from the data, and these studies generally go through an adaptive design, there's generally a frequency of protocol amendments, which I can only imagine throws in more complication. So as the protocol changes, there's a need to estimate these costs quickly. And then there's with the many studies and lots of competition for the patients, new standards of care paradigms. How do you address all these different changes in your budgeting and your scheduling? So I threw a whole bunch of stuff at you guys with protocol amendments, adaptive designs, competition for patients, new paradigms of care. Brad, you want to take a shot at that?
Yeah, no, sure.
See what Bill said. Say it depends.
Well, it depends. No, in a perfect world, in a perfect world, I think we would know where we're going with our study and protocol amendments wouldn't be required. We'd be able to plan up front for everything that could possibly go wrong, everything that could possibly happen, and we would design the perfect study. That's not how it works. And if it was how it works, then there'd probably be no need for any of us. So I think one of the key parts of this is to really, again, sort of go right back to the beginning where Bill said and try and plan out different scenarios. If we get great results in X, what do we do moving forward? If we get poor results in X, what do we do moving forward? And I think it really comes back to that scenario analysis to say, okay, what are all the possible permutations that could happen with this study and where would we go with it? So I don't think that a protocol amendment is necessarily a bad outcome, and certainly not a bad outcome if it's happening because you're getting good data from your study and that data is leading you in a new direction that you otherwise weren't intending on going down.
Okay. Bill, what do you think?
I can just say I concur. Is that?
Yeah. He's,
No. Yeah, I mean,
well, he stole your "it depends" answer, so.
no, it's perfectly acceptable. I think you hit the nail on the head when it comes to, in a perfect world, we wouldn't need protocol amendments. And the reality of it is this is research and we do need protocol amendments. Sometimes they are inevitable, sometimes they're unplanned, sometimes we do them because we didn't plan. So I think there's a lot of different reasons that you could have the frequency of protocol amendments. But it's really to make sure it's not knee-jerk protocol amendments. Really assess that we've covered everything as we do an amendment, that we're looking at the downstream effects. If it is due to recruitment rate, maybe we got one of our inclusion-exclusion wrong, that is restricting a patient population to getting in a study, which could negatively impact your entire study. So you can't just go and change an inclusion-exclusion criteria without it ruining a submission or something along those lines. So I think that you kind of have to carefully look at this on all assets, just to make sure that what we're doing is best for the trial, it's best for the patients. If it means more patients drop out due to competitive products or standard of care, that's a factor we have to play into our adjusting of our expectation of what this trial looks like. If it goes from 10% to 20%, we can't force people to be in our trials. We can only encourage and try to make it as effortless for them as possible. So just kind of understanding that as we do amendments, I think it's important because it is research. It's always changing.
Mm-hmm.
Dropout rates, screen failures, it's all going to be a part of the process. That's why we have them. So.
Radhika?
Yeah, the only thing for me to add is that there are avoidable and unavoidable amendments, right? So yeah, we cannot look through the crystal glass and figure out everything. But I would feel really bad if there was an amendment that happened because of something not being planned for ahead, and that's where, if supposing like we gave that example with the DLTs, planning something, trying to squeeze to a very short timeline because you thought it's going to happen one way and then it happened a different way. Or if, this is where sometimes we've suddenly, then you're up against a particular artificial deadline that was there, and then you're trying to rush and add more sites, and that's, or change something else. So I think as long as it's, I've been in many situations where when we really analyze the cause of that amendment, it was something that could have been foreseen. So I know it's kind of hard to piece these out, and there's always a justification why we didn't do it that time and why we're adding the change now. But and to Brad's point, yeah, we don't know everything. If we knew all of it, then we wouldn't all be here. So I think there is a justification to have amendments, and that in these kind of studies, we do see that more often. But then I think I would just caution that as much planning as we do ahead, if we can avoid some of these avoidable amendments, then we will only be left with hopefully things that truly are needed and need to be done, because each amendment, to Bill's point, is very expensive. You've got to do resubmissions. You lose several months in the process, several $100,000 for each amendment. There are papers out there where they give you a metric of this. And so it really does affect your study execution the more amendments you have. So I think there has to be some thoughtfulness in doing them.
Excellent. All right, well, we're going to go back to a couple questions from the audience. This next one I'm just going to address to Bill and Brad. It's a very loaded question, and you'll understand as soon as I say it. So the question from one of our attendees is, what budget systems do each of you use? What did you use before, and what do you use now? Come on. So Brad, how about you?
Yeah, so sort of going back, what we used to use was really Excel. We had, all of the previous RFP responses that we'd received from CROs. We could sort of try and boil that down into a stage of disease, number of patients to come up with approximate costs. How much is biostats going to cost based on the, CRF pages, based on our stats output, and come up with a ballpark. We've moved forward. We now use Clinical Maestro. One of the great things about that is we can just do so many different scenarios. I think for a study that we're looking at doing at the moment, we've got 24 different scenarios planned, looking at different recruitment rates, looking at different dose levels, looking at different cohort expansions. So I think that has made our life so much easier, where you can spend 20 minutes, make a whole different bunch of assumptions, and you can come up with a ballpark cost pretty quickly. And I know it's going to be a lot more accurate than me going and saying, I think based on these 3 documents from 2 years ago, this is where we're going to end up.
Excellent. I see Bill up there smiling. So go ahead, Bill. You answer the question.
Well,
I'm not asking this person for the question. I got to tell you, this just honestly came.
No,
so.
It's twofold. I'm laughing because my 2.5-year-old came in the room and screamed "Daddy," and my wife's holding her. I felt like the person on CNN.
Oh, there you go.
The kid came in. So no, similar to what Brad's saying as well. Excel, death by Excel, which is great. And you build formulas, and you can build enrollment curves, and you kind of bring in all these different data resources. We have former bids that we've utilized. And that's kind of where it becomes, again, an art form. But really, when you can broad stroke a lot of assumptions and say it's 40 grand to set up a country, or 35 grand per site average. But where it lives is important, so that you can always go back and adjust it. So we do use the portfolio Clinical Maestro tool heavily for all of our studies. And it doesn't have to be 100% accurate. It captures your assumptions, and you can always go back to look at what were your assumptions on this date. And similar to what Brad said, we built this study probably 28 times, and it's gone through 3 different directors' hands through to either attrition or promotions or something along those lines. And the historical content wasn't there, or wouldn't have been there historically, whereas now it's all kept in one place. With dates and enrollment and how you name a scenario, you can pretty much articulate if someone wants to come back and adjust it or compare something. You can compare them very easily. It's within minutes, and it's minimal effort. And even when you're looking at it and you want to identify errors in your assumptions, you can do it. So again, garbage in, garbage out. But if you can systematically put the information in there and keep the scenarios planned, the tool is incredible for that.
Excellent. Radhika, anything to add? I know you're a fan of Clinical Maestro.
Yes, yeah. So I probably shouldn't be saying much, but I can just say that I have seen the world of Excel, before using some system like this, and certainly I've done my fair share of doing all of this in Excel, and having to not only maintain all these different documents, to Will's point, if it changes hands and there's a different person, you've got to hunt up all these files and hand it over. So I think the biggest benefit of using a system like this is the scenario planning, right? Because I think that's one theme which we've repeatedly said throughout this talk, or this webinar, is that you need because none of this is set in stone. Assumptions kind of refine as you're going along, and you need something where it is flexible and nimble enough that you can just update things without having to. Doing that in Excel is almost impossible, and that's why we don't estimate things. Previously, I've also been one of those who just either did it in Excel or sent it across to the CRO. You get an estimate, but you don't have any clarity or behind the scenes thing of what it actually costs when you try to get a ballpark like that. And oftentimes, maybe it's off the mark. And unfortunately, that's what you have to present to senior management. So I think having a system like this is always better. Then you have more control within your own hands. So you, with a lot of confidence, you can stand behind the numbers, and it doesn't have to be perfectly accurate, because at some of these stages you're looking more for a ballpark, and that's sufficient for you to do the planning, right?
Okay, so I'm just going to throw this other. So what about pricing differences between countries? Does the system address those? Radhika?
Oh, yeah, no, of course, yeah. So more than pricing differences between countries, it is more of course, it depends on the assumptions that you put in, but it certainly covers things like the activation, the regulatory timeline, right? So that if supposing, you know, and it also has, you know, based on the countries, the resource costs are completely different. So that is also covered. You know, for example, the data manager in India might be completely different price than the data manager in some other place. So those things, the resource rates are all there, which help you to kind of accurately come up with a budget, and also the timeline. So budget is the cost is one thing. The timeline is also another thing. That is, if you plug in, if you want to activate a site in Germany, for example, the timeline for that is completely different from US, you know, and so those details are also there in the system, so which that is a big help, you know, when you're planning timelines, so you get more realistic timelines. You're not kind of just throwing up an estimate in the air, right? I mean, these are based on actual benchmark data.
Okay, excellent. So let me, I'm going to throw another question. So Brad, do you actually list all of your risks, assess their impact and their probability?
I do actually. So for a current study that we're working on at the moment, I do have a risk register that I've gone through and tried to address the most foreseeable risks that are going to have the biggest impact. Obviously, you can't go through and quantify every single risk that you're ever going to face in a clinical study, but you can address some of the big ones. So, you know, just off the top of my head, things like, you know, recruitment rates, site activations, investigators leaving sites. They're things that we've tried to quantify, as well as come up with plans as to what would we do if this would happen. So, you know, if recruitment is slower than what you expected, you know, there's things like go and add more sites, go and have meetings with the investigator to understand why, look at your inclusion exclusion criteria. Are you unnecessarily excluding cohorts of patients that you could otherwise recruit? So we attempt to do it, but I think the reality is every scenario that you come up with, every risk that you try and mitigate, there's going to be 100 more that you haven't foreseen or that you haven't tried to mitigate or you haven't even identified.
Bill, similar answer?
Yeah, it's pretty similar. I mean, I can't say we do it in as structured of a format as Brad kind of laid out, but we do, when we do build out these scenarios, we'll probably build out longer recruitment time or longer enrollment time, more sites, less sites, more patients, depending on the country mix. A lot of our adjustments in the rare disease space, because our studies aren't generally too large, you kind of see them coming, and our mitigation strategies are unique to the study, but we can use them across the board often. So it's not something unfamiliar, but you know, I can't say we document them in formal format, but we do utilize this tool to really look at all the different possibilities.
Okay, so sort of an ancillary question to that we got, that I'll stay with you, Bill, is the protocol amendment is also a risk at the planning stage. Do you count on it as a certain event or with some percentage likelihood?
Depends. You know, sometimes you have planned amendments at the beginning of a study. You know, that's how we have some of our protocol designs. It really takes I don't want to say an army, but if they're unavoidable or avoidable, as Radhika said, it depends on how you look at the amendment strategy. Is it opportunity to retarget or refocus a protocol amendment? But it depends on the severity. Sometimes it's minor, and it's a clarification, which still costs money, and submissions, is it something you can live with? Is it something you can't live with? It's usually the avoidable ones that probably hurt the most, especially if they're major. But the goal is that we learn from doing this, building the budgets and understanding what an amendment costs. It starts at feasibility. It could be anywhere, but
yeah. Okay, well, we're getting close to the top of the hour. I have one last question for you guys. I'll let you all weigh in on. And I can imagine that with using something like Excel or who knows what else people use, that there's no integration between the budgeting systems used by the sponsors and the CROs, which make it very difficult to do any sort of time consolidation, cost reporting. So how important is it to you and your CRO to be on the same page in terms of timing, budgeting, and reporting? Brad, over to you.
Yes, I've been through a couple of RFP processes, and what you get as a result of that RFP process can vary quite considerably. So for instance, one, we had a full presentation, an Excel document, multiple tabs going through all the assumptions. On the other hand, we had a submission back that was a PDF document. It was 4 pages long and had a total budget summary figure, and that was it. So I think you can get such varying degrees of responses when you're trying to do your budgeting and trying to work with your CROs to understand costs. So one of the things that we try and do is be very specific with how we want the CRO to respond to our budget. So for instance, if they want to include a project management expense, and there's going to be different rates during study startup versus study closeout versus the long middle, we ask them to identify, well, how many months are you going to be doing study startup and study closeout? What are the different rates for those different parts of the studies? That way, when we go back and we're trying to compare between different bids, we actually understand the minutiae of the detail. It's always hard. You're never going to be comparing apples with apples, but that's our approach to try and get as close as possible to be understanding how those budgets differ.
Okay, Bill?
Yeah, I think similar to Brad's point, when we're doing RFPs and RFIs, if we can keep it in a systematic format, which we've tested out with Clinical Maestro in itself, but we've told some of our people who are providing these RFPs and RFIs back to respond within this format. They can provide additional ancillary documents and whatever they feel, but if it doesn't come back in a structured format, we're not going to review it. And it was a position we took so that we could easily compare better apples to apples, and there was some variation there based on their understanding of the question or understanding of what we were asking, but it allowed us to target follow-up questions for those things. And so having that integration, that alignment from CRO to us and other vendors is kind of imperative for a quick analysis, and it just helps everybody be more efficient.
All right, Radhika, I'll give you the last word.
Yeah, no, so absolutely, I think if you had a system, and again, where you could directly compare, right, apples to apples, because I think half the time, you're getting budgets back in different formats, to Brad's point. So I think if, systems such as Maestro allows you to kind of have the same format with, which is, and then everybody is forced to bid in that. So everybody's playing in the same sandbox, I guess. So then it's easier to compare like to like. Otherwise, you're looking at different things and you do not know if somebody has left something out or something has been overestimated, underestimated. You can see the assumptions. So I think that's really the key to this, is really to make sure that you're looking at that you're talking the same language, right? So that it's very clear. Also, sometimes there's scope of confusion of who's doing which task. And so I think having that clarity as well, so that things have not been budgeted for that you didn't ask for, and vice versa, something hasn't been left out that you wanted, I think is really important.
Okay. All right. Well, excellent. Well, there may be a few questions that we didn't quite get to, and I apologize for that, but I do want to make sure we're ending on time. I would like to thank all of my panelists very much for all the time you spent and all your great answers, and it depends, we'll live in intimacy. And Brad, prepare, we're all going to head down a road trip, come and visit you down under. So
Absolutely.
Welcome anytime.
all right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us on this webinar. Thank you panelists, and I hope everybody has a great rest of their day. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.